Oh wait. Just to get an idea of who's in the room, because I know it's kind of a mixed audience. And when I ask questions, because I have keys right, if you raise your hand, how many of you were history buffs in here? History majors, history? Oh wait. How many of you passed the U.S. history region? Okay. Just want to know what we're working with. Oh wait. So on June 9, 1772, there was a loud explosion in the Narragansett Bay of Rhode Island. The next morning, the burned remains of the British Navy ship HMS Gaspee were found floating in the water. The crew of the ship was safely on shore, but the captain had been shot in the knee. The attack gained the attention of men across the British Empire. George Washington, Sam Adams, and even King George wrote about it in their. But how many of you have heard of this? Just those of you who have heard of this with me. We're going to go into a little bit of context first before we get to the event, and then we'll talk a little bit about the specifics. So just to frame this in what's going on in the American Revolution, 1767 we have the passage of the Townsend Act, which very simply put is increased taxes on American colonies to help pay for the French and Indian or 7-Year War that happened previously. Following that, the increase of tax collectors, we have the Boston Massacre, which you've probably all very much heard of, in 1770, and that was a British attack. There was a mob outside the customs house in Boston. Then we have the Gaspee attack that's in 1772. We're going to talk about that plenty. But about 1 year later, we have the Boston Tea Party, which I'm sure you've all heard of before. And then in response to the Boston Tea Party, the British passed the Intolerable Act, and that marked a big change in British policy versus American colonies. And then the Intolerable Act leading into the violence of Lexington and Concord. And part of what I believe is that the Gaspee attack is not an isolated incident, neither is the Boston Tea Party, but one flows into the other, and the Intolerable Act marked the combined response to the Gaspee attack and the Boston Tea Party. One more thing I want to mention before we move into the event is the Molasses Act of 1743, and that put a British monopoly on molasses, meaning that if you wanted to get molasses, you had to buy it from the British Indians. That's important because it creates a monopoly. You can't compete for prices, and the molasses can be brought to New England, distilled into rum, and that's what the guys are talking about today are making. So a little bit on the history of colonial Rhode Island. The economy is dictated by geography. This is a little bit of a sketchy map. We'll get into a better one, but it's a period map, so I wanted to try to include it. If you see, we have the Narragansett Bay in this area over here, and then we have mainland Rhode Island over here. But in the colonial period, almost all of the activity is located within a mile of the shores of the Narragansett Bay. It created great natural harbors, but the hinterland, the land inland, was a little bit less resourceful, so there wasn't much farming or agriculture going on as best it was. Then there's the interesting part of the government. At the time, Rhode Island was the only colony with an elected governor. All the other governors were appointed by the king. So the governor of Rhode Island is probably going to be a little bit more loyal to the people that elect him rather than the king who appointed him. That's going to come into play. We also have an elected General Assembly. These are men that are going to sit like Congress does today, and they make laws, they pass regulations. We also have elected judges. The judges are elected locally. They're also approved by the governor and the General Assembly. Finally, we have elected sheriffs. So the sheriffs are going to be elected from the local population. So, does this look like a monarchy? No. So we have this interesting situation in Rhode Island where every major office is elected from the people that make the laws, to the people that interpret them, to the people that enforce them. One final thing about the background of Rhode Island is that we have two major cities. Newport, which is down on the coast over here. Providence is a bit more inland. Newport, you might know, is famous for the mansions of the robber barons, but it's populated before. There's about 8,000 people at the time of the Gaspee attack compared to 4,000 in Providence. And Newport's an older city. It's got more loyalists, people loyal to the British Empire in it. Providence is going to be more of a younger population, new wealth. If you think old money and new money, the same thing happened back then. So we're going to see people coming from those different towns. The governor of the colony at the time, Joseph Wanson, is from Newport, where he was a customs agent and then became governor. And the deputy governor, Darius Sessions, is from Providence. The government's pretty split. Kinship was a major part. We have a small colony here. We're looking at like 20,000 people. Most 3/4 of them live in two major cities. And intermarriage is big. The Supreme Court justice who's going to become the state Supreme Court justice is a man by the name of Hopkins, and he's married to one of the perpetrators now we're going to look at a few of the important men in the controversy. First, we have John Brown. How many of you have heard of John Brown? How many of you have heard of Brown's birth? It's named after John Brown. John Brown and his family, John Brown, his brother, Moses. Moses was an abolitionist, probably more famous for the Brown brothers. Their father was a self-made merchant. He left his fleet to his sons, and they decided to, they grew the business and expanded trade around the world. They really made their money in the triangle trade. They would send ships to the African coast, get slaves, send the slaves to the Caribbean, trade the slaves for molasses. The molasses would then get brought up to New England, distilled into rum, and then it would be sold. That's how they made their money in the triangle trade. He has an interesting personality. One historian said he rarely complained about the navigation act as long as he could dodge them. He was a libertarian. If we ever saw one, he was anti-government, anti-everything, and it's going to come into play down the road. In opposition to him, we have Lieutenant Dellington. Now, he's a lieutenant in the British Navy. He's not a private citizen, like the earlier tax collectors. He's one of the first Navy officers to do customs regulations in the colony. And he's equally hard-headed as John Brown was. He worked before in Pennsylvania, in the Schuylkill River, and off the coast of Maine. He had a reputation for not tolerating smuggling. So, in Rhode Island, what happened was he stopped a ship and confiscated the cargo as if it was smuggled, and then shipped it up to Boston, where they would impound it until a trial could be held. The reason that it wasn't held locally was because of the legal system. If he held it locally, he was afraid that people were going to that no one, is the sheriff going to hold it? Who's going to hold it? So he was afraid of that. He was afraid they wouldn't get a good trial, that they would just acquit the Green family of smuggling. But the Green family filed suit, and they charged him as a pirate. So there's a warrant out for Lieutenant Dellington's arrest before this attack happened for stealing a ship, basically. So that's John Brown, and this is a impersonator of Lieutenant Dellington. We'll get more into why the impersonation stuff later. So, now we're getting into June 9, 1772, there's a Brown-owned ship, the Hannah, and it's coming up the Narragansett Bay. So the Atlantic Ocean is down here, comes to the Bay, we have Providence up here, Newport over here. So the Gaspee tells it to stop, and it's a package ship, so it's carrying mail and time-sensitive documents. It doesn't want to stop because then it's going to have to wait for a couple hours, be inspected, and then it'll be late to its destination. So it decides to evade the ship and run. And Dellington wasn't as well versed in the shallow waters of the bay as the Captain Hannah was. Now, Brown wasn't the captain, he was the owner, but they were very closely related. So the Hannah kind of did some interesting maneuvering through some shallow waters right up in this section, and lo and behold, the Gaspee hit a sandbar, ran aground. It's interesting because John Brown hit that same sandbar 7 years before when he was a captain of a ship. And the Hannah's captain went back to Providence, ran right to his boss, John Brown, and said, I have the Gaspee stuck on a sandbar. Brown said, I was on that same sandbar. I know it's going to be at least a day before it can get off. Let's figure out what we want to do. So, now they're going to have some fun. So, we have a warrant out for this guy's arrest. Whether that warrant was legal or not is another question. So, then they wait till nightfall. The call to arms is made. There's a drum beat around the town. Everyone gathers at the tavern. Men of the city row out in longboats, and they approach the ship. The ship says to give way for them to stop or they're going to fire, and the men don't. One of the men says that he is the sheriff of Providence, who was John Brown. John Brown was the sheriff of Providence. Although this is not Providence, this is Kent County, right over here. So don't worry, the sheriff of Kent was on the boat also. So they say that they are going to legally search the ship because it's stuck on a sandbar. And the lieutenant says, no, don't enter the ship, that would be an attack on the king. They overwhelm the forces. Someone fires 2 gunshots. The lieutenant gets wounded. He doesn't die, but he gets shot. It's the first time a British officer is shot in the American colonies. So, they remove the crew from the ship, they bring them to the local shore, and then a few minutes later, the ship explodes. No one knows what happened, but the ship flew off. Maybe a stove got knocked over the skirmish, maybe the ship got burned. It lit on fire. So, another interesting fact, as the boats were going away, there are reports that the men on the rowboats leaving the shore pulled down their trousers and revealed their rear ends to the British as they sailed away. So these men obviously did not respect the authority of the British soldiers. The next day, there was a young boy wearing Lieutenant Dellington's beaver felt hat around town, and they really didn't hold this in very high regard. But no one knows what happened exactly that night. There's various stories, no conclusion. So that's the event itself. Now we're going to do a little bit of so, who has jurisdiction in Narragansett Bay? Is it the Navy? It's inside the colony. We saw the map. It goes into the colony. It's not open seas. It's not the high seas. The Navy might not have control over it. So what would happen is the captain of the ship would have to go to the governor and appeal to become a law enforcement officer in the colony, which Dunstan kind of did. He went to Wanton when he came to the island and said, and just met with him just to make sure everything was cool. But he never officially presented his commission to the governor. So technically, he might be a pirate. No one knows. Another issue is what law should we use to charge something? If someone burned a British ship, something has to happen. But what laws happen? In the colony, there's common law. The colony is developing its own legal system at the time. But under that system, Dunstan would be a pirate. This British officer would be a pirate. The British also had their own law. So in the charter, in the Rhode Island Charter, it says laws should be contrary and repugnant unto you, but not as near as may be, but as near as may be agreeable to the laws of our realm of England. So they can make their own laws, but they need to fall under law. You can't break the Great Britain's laws in Rhode Island. It also said local courts had authority. Local courts had authority over all actions, cases, matters, and things happening in the said colony and plantation. So if something happened in the colony, it should be charged by the local courts. They had that authority. But now we have this conflict of a British Navy ship in a local court. Who's charging them? What if they conflict? And the judges are already kind of creating judicial review. Hopkins comes out and somewhat publicly says that he will defend the raiders. He doesn't say it publicly, but he tells various people that in his interpretation, the sheriffs were executing a illegal search of the ship, and those got knocked over. Maybe a British soldier shot the captain by accident in the skirmish. No one knows what happened. I don't think we should have a trial. So, we don't even know what's going to happen next. Now, what's the attack colonial resistance of treason? And this is important. Up to this time, everything has been treated as resistance. If you have a mob, it's resistance. You're not, you have the right to petition the government. Even under the British, you have a certain amount of rights to do that. But there is a line when it becomes treason. And if it is treason, the men can be brought to England for trial. There's a precedent for that. So, under Henry VIII, there's an act called the Act of the Trial of Treasons Committed out of the King's Dominion, which was enacted to allow Irish people to be tried at Westminster at the King's Bench for treason. But the colonists were not Irish, they were Englishmen in America. Irish were not very well respected by the English at the time, but these were their brothers in America. So, are they allowed to have the same rights as British citizens? Also, King George recognizes this event. He goes to the House of Lords and says, these people need to be tried for treason. The House of Lords said, yes, we should try and make an example of them. But the House of Commons objects. And they point to a British law that says that it's not a trial by jury, it's a trial by jury of syndic. It's a complicated word, but it just means proximity, somewhere close. There's also a Dockyards Act, which says that if you destroy a British ship in a dockyard, that's treason. But this isn't a dockyard, it's in a bay, but it's not the open sea where the Navy has jurisdiction, it's a bay. So it's a gap in the legislation. So we're seeing gaps emerging in the laws. No one knows what to do. And are the colonists entitled to a local trial? If it was a dockyard, if it was a violation of the dockyards law or an act of treason, they would not be, but it was the building. So, there's some immediate results that come out of this. We have the Gaspee Commission, which is established by the Vice Admiralty. Admiralty courts were a system of courts across, which were British judges brought to America to protect British laws. They were not trial by jury, they were trial by judge. So, they were supposed to be able to enforce whereas if you had a jury of New Englanders, they would probably just acquit everything. So the commission was made up of the Vice Admiralty Justice, so this is like the second justice in the Vice Admiralty Court. We have the Governor Wanton of Rhode Island. We also have the Chief Justices of the State Courts of Massachusetts, Colonial Courts of Massachusetts, New Jersey, and New York. So those are all loyal. These are all people appointed by the king, except for Wanton, who was elected. They went from the fall of 1772, so the attack happened in June. They started around August, all the way for a year and a half until the winter of 73, 74. And surprise, surprise, they don't find anything. No one's willing to talk. No one's good at tournaments. It's that whole kinship bond. It's the whole kinship bond. So, what happened happens next is the Committees of Correspondence. And the Committees of Correspondence have been set up to back the Stamp Act, but now they're kind of bigger and they're more important because people are afraid that they're going to be sent to trial. So there's a few different things for motivation of these acts, one of which a historian calls the Gaspee narrative. And that's the act of self-interest out of those for independence. So the interest of John Brown to avoid taxes coincided with the Act of Liberty. So it's convenient that he fueled the American Revolution, but perhaps not intentional. We also have the issues of local autonomy versus imperial rights. Who has the right to the trial? Is it the state of the colony of Rhode Island, or is it the King's Court? In the middle of all this, we have the Boston Tea Party. And this is kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back. The British government says, no, we can't let this happen anymore. We need to start trying people for treason. We have, and then that marks the shift of the treatment of colonists, subjects, from British citizens to colonial subjects. And they're allowed to be extradited to England. So today, Gaspee attack is kind of remembered only in Rhode Island. Most of you haven't heard of it. They have a craft fair with a little parade. They run a 5K race down here. They burn a ship in effigy. They have different celebrations, and this is how it's remembered. It's not remembered in many other ways, and there's a great virtual archive. All of the documents from the commission, all of the testimonies, the letters are all preserved, and they can be accessed by people across the country, yet we only study it in Rhode Island. So my conclusion is a few things. There's a big movement in the American Revolution in the historiography, studying the history of it, to look at the popular history, look at the people's history. What do the little guys do? But this is definitely a kind of legal importance. This is rich white guys arguing with rich white guys. And although, it's important to recognize the contributions of smaller men to the revolution, this is an understudied event that includes some pretty big names. So why don't we teach it? And I think it has a few things. How many of you know Paul Revere? Yes. So one historian says perhaps if John Brown's name rhymes as well as Paul Revere's in the poem by Longfellow, we'd remember him. And sometimes public history is as small as that. If your name just sounds better, it happens. Rhode Island was mostly merchants. They were doing this out of their own selfish motivation. So after the war, John Brown doesn't pay taxes to the American government. What a surprise. This guy really isn't out to get the British, he's just out to not pay taxes. He even fueled Shays' rebellion. He was charged with fomenting dissent in the state of Massachusetts. So this guy's acting out of his own interest. He's acting in a colony where everything's kind of interconnected. But yet, this is such an important step on the road to revolution that I think without it, things might have happened. And it's interesting, one last thing, is what if the British had decided to send troops